My guest today is Stephen Berkoff, an actor, author, playwright, theatre practitioner, and director. He was born in what was once the Jewish East End of London, and Stephen's grandparents emigrated to England from Eastern Europe at the end of the 19th century. During the Second World War, the family evacuated to Luton, and in 1947 they moved, albeit briefly, to the United States before returning to England. Over the course of his critically acclaimed career, Stephen has adapted Kafka, directed Shakespeare, and played a number of Hollywood villains. As a practitioner, he is known for his dramatic in-your-face style, a bold, unfiltered, visceral brand of theatre, and he has since spoken out frequently about anti-Semitism. Stephen, thank you very much for joining. How are you doing?
Oh, yes, thank you. I'm doing very well.
Good, good. I'm really glad to hear it. It's really good to have you on. I mean, let me start with your childhood, if that's all right. What do you remember
Yeah.
about life in the Jewish East End? How do you feel about its passing?
I think it's a great tragedy that it's passed because there was an incredible unity amongst the people and a celebration of almost every day-to-day living, whereby people communicated, saw each other, went out, loads of cinemas, cafes, even theaters, and theaters even were speaking Yiddish. There was a tremendous, colorful atmosphere, and you never felt you were hard done by. You always found something that would interest you and that was compelling. And so I was quite happy, even if I lived in a slum street, just a couple of rooms at the time with my mother.
Growing up in the 1930s and 40s, you saw the rise of Sir Oswald Mosley's Black Shirts in London, the political party formerly known as the British Union of Fascists and National Socialists. Your uncle Sam was a hero of the anti-fascist riots in 1936. What was he like, and what did you learn from him?
Well, my uncle Sam was my father's slightly younger brother. He was an adventurer, an explorer, a traveler, and he was always in a state of total optimism. And he had a tremendous passion for literature. So although he was mainly a trouser cutter, he always had a book by him and he would read voluminously. He'd even try understanding Shakespeare and even learning passages of Shakespeare. So this is quite a unique man. And so because of this, he was incredibly left-wing, liberal, compassionate, and viewed the world as something that had to be dealt with by virtue of understanding and freedom and tolerance. And so he joined the Communist Party, which he then left when Russia invaded Hungary, when he thought that was intolerable. But he was around in 1936 during the Cable Street riots when Oswald Mosley tried to march down the east end of London with his thousands of thugs. And he was one of the leading um, members of that group that stood by and fought back, along with many others, including the Irish Dockers, quite well known. And he's even featured in a mural that is still there in Cable Street, a brilliant mural depicting that day. And so Sam Berkowitz was somebody you could look up to. I did. He was such an idealist. And I knew him quite well because he was my uncle, and he would take me and his little son out when he could on the weekends just to walk around London and go to the Cameo cinema we used to go to in Piccadilly every Saturday. And funnily enough, we used to walk all the way back from Piccadilly to the East End, and it was enjoyable. So he was a tremendous man, and I have nothing better to say about him except that he was totally caring and aware of you and sensitive to you and a loving person, for which my own father unfortunately did not have those qualities.
You mentioned a moment ago the name Berkowitz. Now that was your family's original name, but your father anglicized it, changing it to Berks in an effort
Yes.
to assimilate. Could you tell us more about the circumstances under which this decision was made?
Well, I don't know because as soon as I was born, I was a Berks, and that's the name I had for many years. But I think it was when he was trying to work in England in the 20s. He found it better, more conducive to shorten it to
Mm,
become anglicized, because wherever he went, it was, say, Berkowitz. Then he might have problems with getting employment. Although, since everybody in the East End had names like Berkowitz, I don't see why that should have been a problem. But for him, it was. And so as I grew older, I felt the name Berks was a little bit uh, uninteresting, unattractive, and had no meaning. So I thought I'd recover a syllable or two from the original. So rather than go back to Berkowitz, but I go to Berkoff,
mm.
which I've found quite suitable for me and seems to suit me.
I want to ask you about your work. One of your later works in 2013, you wrote Religion and Anarchy,
Oh, yes.
which consists of five short plays about Jews and the Holocaust, which were named Guilt, Roast, Line Up, Gas, and How to Train an Anti-Semite. Could you tell us about this, specifically how to train an anti-Semite?
Oh, yes. I love doing this because there's so much anti-Semitism around that I thought I would, and it wasn't terribly sophisticated. It was a bit brutish and bit stupid and basically based on lies. So I thought I'd write a play, How to Train an Anti-Semite, by having these two very ordinary working class Gentiles talking about the Jews. And so I summoned up all the various marvelous, amazing, fantastical, bizarre prejudices about the Jews of these two people just sitting there talking about them and then gradually expressing all their frustrations and their bitterness and their, um, you know, concern about the Jews and what they see in the telly. And so that was just the beginning, How to Train an Anti-Semite. But then the smart thing was in the second play, the same two people are playing two Jewish people in the kitchen. And they're exactly the same actors, but suddenly they've turned into two Jews. And they were talking about the problems, but in a very, very sensitive, dignified, in a way, but also limited, very, very limited. And suddenly I thought I'd write a play where everything was about food, that they couldn't speak about anything about when are the latkes ready and how's the chicken soup and oh, when are you going to get this a cheesecake and this, all about food. From it never stopped. And then the the crux of it is that the wife, as her son has left home, his son's called Leslie, which was my first name originally, and he's left home. I don't know why. He just couldn't cope with home. So, but she misses him so badly, and she misses him, and she sometimes thinks when they have these lovely suppers on Friday night, oh, if only Les could be here. And she says to her husband, why don't you call him? Make up with him. So we understand that he's had a falling out with his dad and he's left home. And so it's a terribly sad, almost tearful story. And then I read a story about how a young kid was thrown into an oven because the child used to play in the streets in some small little German town. And he loved this little kid. They used to play together. So I did. I played with Gentiles all the time. And one day the boy said, it was Sunday. He said, I can't play today. I'm going to this church. And the little Jewish boy said, oh, can I come in? I've never been inside a church. He said, oh, you must come in. You must come in. So he joins the little boy in the church. And then the priest comes round and gives the Eucharist. And he goes and gives the wafer and a sip of wine to the boy. And the little boy runs all the way home. And he says, oh, Mummy, I've been in the cathedral. It's so beautiful, and all the angels and the lights and the shining through the stained glass and paintings of the windows. And then the priest came round and gave us this biscuit and a little sip of wine. It's so wonderful. And the father said, you what? You crazy, how dare you? So that was the story. How dare you do that? Was you went into a church and you had that? You're disgusting. You're not my son. And he opened the oven door of their own house. It was winter time. The fire was blazing, and he threw his own son in the oven. Well, the wife is horrified. So she runs out into the street screaming, help, help. And then a few men come in and they attempt to open the oven door. And eventually they do get it open and they expect to find a dead boy there. And then they manage just to drag him out and they look at him and the boy is untouched. There's not a scorch mark. It's phenomenal. And they can't understand why. Why is this? And they look at the little boy and they see that he still had grasped in his hand, because he didn't eat it all, the biscuit, the flesh of Christ. And that is what saved him. He had the flesh of Christ in his hand. So they were just astounded. And they took the father, said, how dare you do this? And look what you've done. This boy has been saved by Christ. They took the father and threw him in the oven instead. So that's the story. It's one of the famous anti-Semitic stories of the Middle Ages. So I just had to put that into a play. And then lastly, I had to do something that's never been done to show the march to the concentration camp, line up, and then gas. Well, I wanted to create something that not just because it had never been done, but it hadn't. And I wanted to show a scene in a gas chamber. And I had these four bright young men. Man, how are we going to do it? And we thought of maybe erecting a small ladder, climbing up different steps, different heights. But then I thought of how my master, the great mime teacher, Jacques Lecoq, would have done it. And so we would have done it as sculpture, because that's what we used to practice, how you can use another body and moving it, shaping it, you sculpt it as if you're molding a sculpture. So I thought, well, I'm going to try that. So I had the one working on the second man. Then the third man comes in and he sculpts the other two. Then the fourth man comes in and whatever he finds from the prior sculpture, he adds to. So they're all crawling round each other, climbing nearly over each other, twining themselves round, through them, over them, climbing them as they're gasping. And then the light just focuses a top light on that group as they're gasping to get their breath. And they're just saying to each other, we'll see each other, have hope, don't fear, just breathe, take it in, take it all in. And they did this scene, which knocked people out, knocked people sideways. And so that was first time I've attempted it on these 5 one-act plays, which we did just only once at the German Street Theatre, but that was one of the most exciting things I've ever done, but nobody picked it up. Nobody would have said, "Oh, come on, would love to do it again." But that was something which I enjoyed immensely. So very often, since you ask, I've gone back to Jewish themes.
Mm.
So I find them quite interesting in the ritual of them. But the ritual which fascinates me is the ritual of death and what we call sitting Shiva, and where you friends, relatives, colleagues, when somebody has died, they go and visit the house, and over a period of 7 days, they'll choose an hour or a half a day or just a few minutes to sit as part of it. Now, as a young man, I used to hear that, and how I heard it as sit and shiver. So I thought that's what you do. You mourn, and when you're mourning, you're sitting, and because you're in grief, you're trembling, you're shivering. That's because of your anxiety, and you're upset or crying. So it seemed to make great sense. So only later did I learn it's not sit and shiver. That's how we always practiced it when we used to hang around the East End or Stamford Hill. So then I learned it's sitting Shiva. So I thought, what an idea. I would use that idea to get a group of my own family, and I put them all in the play, and my own family sitting Shiva and waiting for their friends and relatives, and they all talk about the deceased, represented, of course, by my late dad. And they talk what a wonderful man he was, and how, isn't it strange how, you know, well, it's strange that how important one becomes when one's dead. Everybody, I could only the most wonderful, noble attributes are given to you, and you never really find out. So I had this man, uh, Davis, I believe his name was, Barry Davis, a Jewish man who spoke Yiddish. And we did it at the Hackney Empire eventually. And he did it. He played my Uncle Sam. So in a way, it was a memorial for my devoted, dearest Uncle Sam. And this guy, Barry Davis, played it. Of course, we all did it, all in English. But when he talks about how he used to be in the theatre and he used to play King Lear, and he used to do it in Yiddish when he did the great storm sequences of blow wind and Amrak and all that. I can't remember that now. And he did it in Yiddish, and that was incredible. So those were the two plays, and then I decided to write a play about anxiety. Of course, I wrote a play about East, which is about dynamics of extreme experiences and joy, as well as sadness. But I thought, what I was getting anxious as I was approaching middle age about little things, and my mother used to have it, and I think I caught it from her because whenever she had a problem, she would say, "Oh, Stevie, I've got a kvetch." A kvetch, that's a German word, means a pinch, like your nerve is pinched. You're something you're caught in a grip of some overwhelming and most horrific anxiety. A kvetch could be about anything. Could be about a pair of shoes, or what if you dare wear an expensive watch, or whatever. It's often so trivial. That's the nature of this bloody kvetch. So I wrote a play called Kvetch, and what I did is just to show every kind of anxiety that there is and put it into the mouths of the five characters. And I had some very good actors. I had Henry Goodman as a visitor, and then Anita Dobson as my wife. And I played the main part, and I wrote it and directed it. And I did it, first of all, in Los Angeles, an American version, which suited it very well. ran for 5 years in a small theatre. Then we did it in the West End, the Garrick. I even got an award, Evening Standard Comedy of the Year. And I don't even consider myself a comic writer, but that was fetch, and there's funny nobody's wanting to do it. And it's just hysterically funny play and deals with all those awful problems we all face, not just Jews, Gentiles too. And so that's the end of my that's the end of my work. That's the end of my career.
Let me ask you a question that I've asked all of our guests
Yes.
on the podcast, which is, if someone who is not Jewish comes to you and says that they want to help in the fight against anti-Semitism, where should they start?
Well, in the fight against anti-Semitism, you start looking at what is going on and maybe acquaint yourself with the history. Start reading some of the history of the Jewish writers and the Jewish history in Europe. I think then you'll be able to maybe just get a bit of background into what they've gone through and the horrors that they went through, and how anti-Semitism started. Well, it's racism or anti-Semitism started many, 1,000 years ago in England. We were the worst anti-Semites, and we were butchers, not only anti-Semites, but absolute violent butchers. And we had the worst when Jews were accused of killing a Christian child in Lincoln, I believe in the 12th century, and the Jews were all arrested. It was a trumped-up case. Those are the kind of things they should learn about the amazing culture that we have, the weird and amazing history and its values.
Before we wrap up, let me just ask, what have you got going on? What have you got coming up? And where can people find you?
They can always get me on my website. And I sell on my website all my books, DVDs of my productions. Not all of them, I haven't put all of them, unfortunately, but many of them. And so if they want to get a list of them, do please go on my website, or whatever it's called, Stephen Berkoff, and they will see it there. In the meantime, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Stephen, thank you so much for coming on Podcast Against Anti-Semitism.